All right, as you know, we've done the David Lynch Dune. We did a podcast and we did a fairly in-depth analysis back here in this old video. You can see that I did about 4 years ago. And it's called Dune Explained Full Film Novel Analysis. And that really focused on the first novel, which, if you don't know, Dune, written by Frank Herbert, is the biggest selling sci-fi series of all time. Particularly, Dune is the most popular science fiction single volume book of all time. And I would make an analogy to Lord of the Rings, kind of what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy. The Dune series is to science fiction. And I grew up watching the David Lynch Dune, and I've always liked it. People hate on it, but even David Lynch doesn't like. I'm not a fan of Dune. I don't want to speak about it. But you gotta love the little 4-year-old psycho version of Aliyah.
And how can this be? For he is the Queen of Gesserit.
I like everything about the David Lynch version. I don't understand why people hate on it. I listened to somebody's podcast and they said that they watched the movie and it didn't make sense. And that's because they were watching the modern truncated versions. You got to watch the 3/4 hour special versions of it. I'm coughing up spice. I was drinking my spiced coffee this morning and it got me hacking up. So, Dune, as we know, is Frank Herbert's late 60s science fiction masterpiece novel. And the reason it's unique is that, number one, it's a well-written book. It's very complicated. Much like Lord of the Rings, Dune will require you to actually pay attention. You'll have to listen to sections more than once. You will have to do decoding work. It requires an esoteric analysis because it's extremely complex plot-wise. It deals with multiple philosophical and scientific ideas and religious ideas in a perennialist fashion throughout a series of kind of Game of Thrones-y type stuff. I feel like I'm not a huge Game of Thrones fan, but the way that Game of Thrones approaches power struggles and courtly intrigue and espionage, very reminiscent of what you have in Dune. And there's a little bit of that in Lord of the Rings, but Dune is much more of an adult and sophisticated presentation of these types of narratives and archetypes than Lord of the Rings is. Now, I'm not knocking Lord of the Rings. I think it's a masterpiece, obviously, full of a lot of depth and symbolism and Neoplatonism, as we've talked about in the past. But what we have with Herbert's Dune is very different. It's a very different approach to religion. We're going to see a lot of influences of Nietzsche, of, as we said, Perennialism, Sufism, Islam, Far Eastern philosophies like Qi and Zen ideas. I know Qi is an idea, it's not philosophy, but these are ideas that will recur. Other ideas, too, that were probably kind of revolutionary for the time in terms of quantum physics and whatnot. The idea of reality being at a fundamental level, energy, and energy in different forms. And that seems to be what Herbert is working with as a physics and metaphysics for his story. We'll also notice that it's kind of it's a classic hero's tale, sure, but it's also a classic hubris tale in the Greek sense of being concerned with leadership temptations. What are the primary things that bring down a dynasty? I would say that's the main kind of practical theme of Dune. But even though we've covered Dune in depth, and we'll rehearse a little bit of that, today's discussion is not actually about Dune. I do want to talk about the Villeneuve Dune. You can't say, I've been saying for years, Denis Villeneuve, because that's how it's wrote out. You know what I'm saying? When I read it wrote out, that's what's triggered in my mind. And then all of the know-it-alls come along. You don't know nothing about movies because you mispronounce his name as Villeneuve. Okay, whatever. Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve, who will be doing not just the sequel to Dune, which is not the book sequel. It's the second half of part 1. The sequel is Dune Messiah, which I just finished. And it was really profound for me because at the same time as I was reading Dune Messiah, I was going through Italy and seeing a lot of influence of the state in the church, historically speaking. As you know, I did a little bit of analysis of this text, The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy by Papadakis and Meyendorff, and the first 70 pages or so is a really in-depth analysis of the Gregorian reforms and how the papacy was revolutionized by becoming this sort of autocracy in the 11th century. And then you had this Germanic control of the papacy for about 100 years, where the popes were basically appointed via nepotism and via kingly control out of Germany. That's in the 11th century. People like Henry and popes like Leo IX and Gregory VII, the famous Pope of Dictatus Papae, whereas I've likened him in the past to the first to proclaim himself the Kwisatz the God Emperor. So there are a lot of parallels to Dune, because Dune is, as we know, a sophisticated story where Herbert's exploration of religion is not just as either true or false, but viewed from different perspectives by different people in different power structures and strata of society. For example, the elite in Dune, this would be the Chom space navigating guild, the people that use the spice as a kind of commodity and fuel to fold space to travel. And they have a kind of a monopoly over space travel, the guild navigators with the big old vajayjay face. You know, the fishy vajayjay face guys, if you remember Dune by David Lynch. Them boys in the big tanks. The emperor is the universe is ruled by the emperor Padishah Shaddam, Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, the Corino emperor of the known universe. And what's interesting as you get into the second novel, if you just read the first one or just watch the first movies of part 1, you don't really get the full arc of Paul, because Paul, as we'll find out, isn't as much of a hero as you might think. And this is fascinating because it really distinguishes Paul from a kind of a Christ figure that you think he might be. If you watch the David Lynch version, as you know, it ends with Paul victorious over the Emperor and the Harkonnens, and he sort of gives them an ultimatum. He kills Sting by, saying he's the Word of God or whatever, and then Sting splits in half or what. And it's a very memorable scene. I've always liked that scene, and I was like, oh, that's kind of Christological, isn't it? Because he's calling himself the Word of God. And we have in the Fremen, who are the native wild desert folk of the planet Dune, Arrakis. We have the Fremen with this prophecy, as you know, who believe that the Kwisatz Haderach, the Lisan al-Gib, the voice from the outer world, who will come and bring jihad, holy war, to cleanse the universe for righteousness. And this is where we verge out of Christology and much more into Islamic theology, because Paul actually becomes this Muhammad type of character who wittingly or unwittingly acquiesces to a timeline wherein there was a universal jihad that ends up killing like 60 billion people or something like that. Some crazy space number of 60 billion people across the known universe. But in the first story, right, in the first Dune, we just see Paul as the kind of savior figure, the hero archetype, who undergoes an initiation. Right, he undergoes an initiation through taking the spice and then through the drinking of the water of life, which is the bile of the worm, the giant worms on Dune, which look like giant you-know-whats. You know what I mean. I'm talking about giant hot dogs. What were you thinking, you damn perv? Get out of here, you damn perv. Now I'm talking about giant hot dogs on Arrakis. Did I have a picture of them? I'm trying to see if I had a picture of any hot dogs on Arrakis. Can I get one of them hot dogs from Arrakis? Please, no mustard, extra buns. I'm not seeing any of the worms. So I did a whole... There we go. Is that a worm? No. Anyway. That little dude right there, that's a shrimp. That's a shrimp off of Arrakis. You got to put them in a pot, boil it at about 3,500 degrees, and you get that Dune shrimp. Forgot what I was talking about. Dune shrimp. I'm still sick. Excuse me. Dreams are messages from the deep. Anyway, I was talking about the different strata of society. That's what it was. And how they all view religion in their own way. And I'm not aware of a sci-fi novel that really has that much depth. And I guess that's one of the reasons why people who are probably on the Spurgatron scale like this novel, this series a lot. The Emperor and his crew, he runs a giant warrior cult known as the Sardaukar. They are a kind of warrior mystics, knights who will go out in a very pagan, bloodthirsty Viking way. And they were influenced by berserkers, and they'll just basically slaughter everyone. They're raised on a prison planet called Salusa Secundus, where people are trained and bred in horrible situations from youth to be Sardaukar, the Emperor's shock troops, super soldiers. The origin, I'm pretty sure I've heard Lord Voldemort say this probably 15 years ago, but the title for Prison Planet came from Dune, right? I remember, folks, if you ever read Dune, it tells you everything. And that's really why we're covering Dune, right? Dune does tell us everything. I could say everything I know about geopolitics I learned from Dune. Because you're going to see every area of societies, particularly traditional societies, with nobility, aristocracy, bloodlines, and all of that. That's fundamental to the first story, Dune 1. And not only that, the occult plays a key role in it. And this is where I'm very confident that with the character of Herbert, he had to have been influenced by quite a bit of 1960s perennialism, esotericism, and occultism. We know, for example, that the spice melange, the resource that is both a fuel to make you travel through space in a quick way, folding space. It's not only a fuel, it's also a powerful hallucinogen that expands consciousness and extends life. And it gives you the blue within blue eyes. So, yes, I have been taking my spice, as you can see. So, for, as we said, the different strata of society, not only do they want to control religion, and that's the witch cult, and there's a group of witches known as the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood. They're a very powerful order of witches who have mastered these different techniques, such as telepathy, and what they call the weirding way, which is this will to power where you speak something and you overpower someone else, or you speak a killing word, and your word, if it's amplified at the right frequency, can break bones, break stones, and so forth. So kind of a Tesla notion of frequencies that can split glass or split ass. You know what I'm saying? If you got to just take somebody out, you just use that weirding way. And I like the way they did that in the David Lynch Dune. That was enjoyable. We don't get a lot of that in the new version. But regardless, we do have this different strata of society. And in regard to the witch cult, the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, they have seeded throughout the universe through their, what they call the Missionaria Protectiva, the protective missionaries. They have seeded throughout the generations their own religious mythology. And they've done that because they want to control the universe's super being, the Kwisatz Haderach, when they produce him. And they are producing him through generations and generations of intermarriage and genetic manipulation. So they want to marry the people to the right people to produce better, fitter, more elite offspring. And this, of course, is the attitude that we have of a lot of the elite in history, particularly as we get into the Victorian period with the rise of Malthusianism and eugenics and so forth. The idea being that if we can interbreed and intermarry more and more selectively, we can produce, basically these Dexter-level super psycho beings. And we get quite a bit of that in Dune. So I think Herbert was very aware of that's the elite modus operandi. That is how the elite operate in terms of their mystical bloodline philosophy that they have. And in the case of Dune, as you know, this plan of the coven, of the sisterhood, is interrupted because Jessica, the mother of Paul Atreides, the protagonist, she decides to go ahead and have a male child. And she was instructed to put the male children to death until they had produced the universe's super being, whom they thought would be presumably a girl. Thus, the most powerful being would be under the control of the witches of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and then they could, by proxy, be the power behind the throne when they produced the universe's girl boss, the super slay queen. We didn't get that, though. We get the male offspring who's not supposed to exist, and Jessica decides, in a very Moses-type situation, not to put him to death. So she protects the child, saves him. There's a lot of Moses imagery as well. Moses goes into the desert. Paul ends up with his mom going off into the desert, into the wilderness. So we see a lot of biblical imagery that does pop up. And if you don't know, the future religion of Dune is a syncretized version of Islam and Catholicism, as well as other influences like Stoicism and Zen. So they actually call it the Orange Catholic Bible, which is this collection of kind of random mystical texts, some from the Bible, some from Islam and the Quran, which has produced this future religion. Again, we're in the year 10191, which is 20,000 years into the future from where we are today. So they have some other, space nerdy way to date things. So it's not the year 2191, it's 10191, which is for some reason 10,000 years, 20,000 years in the future. But one thing that's fascinating, as we said, aside from the geopolitical stuff and the attempt to control the resources, and it's all about that, right, which is controlling the spice, because whoever controls the spice and utilizes it effectively will be the most powerful force in the universe. And at this time, it is the emperor who runs things through his fealty by the various noble houses called the Landsraad. And the noble houses submit to the emperor, but they also have a power to kind of stand against the emperor if all of them, for example, felt that the emperor was doing something wrong. So it's the possibility is always there of lesser nobility, right, standing up against even the emperor of the known universe. Paul is this figure who, as we said, is the archetype. He's the hero, we think, in the first novel. He suffers from a lot of defects and flaws in Dune Messiah, which shows a significant departure from him being any kind of Christ-like figure. He's very Christ-like in certain ways in Dune, but then we get a very fallen, Machiavellian, Ubermensch type of figure in Dune Messiah. And he doesn't completely become a villain, but he has villainous traits. But he ends up ultimately being good, so I won't spoil that or explain how he ends up being good. But Paul, as we know, has been born out of the plan of the witches. So he's throwing up a middle finger to the bitches from the beginning, the wish bitches. And from an early date, Paul has dreams and visions, right? He's this mystical figure who will kind of like the Sardaukar. He's not a Sardaukar, but he will be a kind of mystical warrior poet figure. And he sees visions. He sees the future. He sees himself with his future girlfriend, Chani, from the the tribe of the Fremen. He sees himself in different timelines based on what he chooses as he gets more and more exposed to the spice. So the spice transforms Paul into I guess we could say, kind of like a Greek god in a way. It's much more pagan than any notion of a biblical god. He's not uncreated. It's more of an adoptionist or Nestorian view, right, where he gradually discovers his own godhood. But for Herbert, the theology of this universe, and presumably of his own philosophy and worldview, it's not stable. He's more of a process philosophy proponent. And so that's why he sees all the religions really just kind of blending together and expressing some higher inexpressible truth. And this is where we get the idea of it being perennial. So what's where I get it, right? The Philosophia Perennis. Now, perennialism existed prior to the 1960s. It existed, you could argue, in various ways, going back to people like Marsilio Ficino or Pico della Mirandola in the Renaissance period, because of its fixation on Neoplatonism. And so in just a very general sense, perennial philosophy is referred to as the perennial wisdom, perspective in philosophy and spirituality that views religious traditions as sharing some higher single metaphysical truth or origin, right? So it's sort of like the religions are like the skeleton of a higher source. They're the frontispiece, and they're all kind of expressing the same ideas. And the way that we know what that higher truth is through some sort of esoteric metaphysical knowledge. So you'll notice in a lot of the perennialists, the focus on metaphysics. And by perennialists, it's not that easy to really define. Some people might say Neoplatonists are perennialists. Some people might critique that. Some people might say, people like René Guénon or Friedrich Schuon, those are really the sort of archetypal perennial philosophy guys of the 20th century. And the idea originates in the Renaissance, where people say, well, maybe there's, truth in all religions. And so if there's truth in all religions, then there must be some higher true religion. And this, I think, is why you see people like Huxley, who many people don't think Huxley was really a perennialist, but he did write a book called The Perennial Philosophy, which was his eventual acceptance of Vedanta, right? He did accept Advaita Vedanta. And so you'll find that most of the time, the perennialists, not always, but most of the time, they're inspired by Neoplatonism, Sufism, mystical Islam, and things like Vedanta and esoteric aspects of Hindu philosophy. But there's overlap with a lot of other traditions, Eleusinian mysteries, people like Hermes Trismegistus. There's a lot of different overlaps in areas where people could say this perennial philosophy. But this is why we can see, for example, elements of traditionalism or the traditionalist school and perennialism in Herbert, even though Herbert doesn't have anything to do with Vedanta. For whatever reason, I'm not aware of any Hindu imagery. It's typically Christianity and Islam and various forms of Far Eastern mysticism like Zen that pop up. Although at times we do have mention of future apologists 10,000 years from now who become famous as a schism of Christianity known as Stoic Christianity. So he envisioned this future universe where there was all kinds of schisms and heresies. And it kind of reminds me of, who's that Mormon dude? The guy that wrote Ender's Game, right? If you remember Ender's Game, it's like there's a planet of Mormons, there's a planet of Catholics. It's kind of like that. That idea is probably borrowed from what you see in Dune, where you have basically different schisms and heresies and religions in space. Religions in space! And in the Dune series, there's 6 of these, and they're really complex, so we're just talking about the first 2. We get off into all kinds of crazy sects and spin-offs in the later installments. We'll get another religion called the Church of Muad'Dib. We're going to get... Muad'Dib is Paul Atreides, by the way. We'll get another religion called the Elixir of Life religion, the Golden Way or something, the Golden Chalice or something like that. But that's all for the later installments when we get into the era of Paul's children of Dune. But So that's the background from a traditionalist perspective. And in my view, somebody was saying in one of their analyses, it's largely Sunni. There are mentions of Sunni type ideas, I guess, with jihad and whatnot, but the tendency amongst the Fremen is full of a lot of paganism. And the drug element, to me, suggests a very obvious Sufi connection, because there are elements of Sufism, especially in Afghanistan, where they still have a place for imbibing, pretty hardcore drugs and going on trips and getting wisdom from, smoking opium. I mean, Afghanistan is a big opium region, and I think that although the spice is not a one-to-one with any specific thing, we know that it's based in part on LSD and shrooms, according to Herbert. But, I mean, the control of drugs as a resource is also, I think, pretty obvious in the story. And that's why linking it to Sufism in Afghanistan is interesting, because there you have the mystical use at times. It's not widespread, but at times of opium. And so let's go back to my original analysis where I talked about the novel's usage of Islamic mysticism brings to mind ancient Afghani Sufism. And I'll explain why, because it reminded me of the Gould and Fitzgerald book that's really good called Invisible History, which details the importance of Afghanistan's role in the Middle East and geopolitical power moves of the last few centuries. And it's not just because of the drug trade. There's also a mystical significance that a lot of people don't know about. And I think this plays into Herbert's novel, because there's a lot of what we could say is kind of Gnostic and Illuminist tendencies in Herbert's novel. I mean, Paul's pathway to becoming a demigod is principally through the hallucinogenic ritual initiation experiences that he has with the spice, which again is basically LSD. So we're not just in some sort of pure rationalist or bookish Islam. We are in a pagan-ish Islam-ish, Catholicism-ish religion, where you can attain this sort of status through direct drug experience, through mystical drug initiation. And that's exactly what happens with Paul. In fact, there's a pretty vivid, well-described scene in the first novel when Paul really goes through the initiation. That's a pretty accurate description of a hardcore, like a bad trip. And if you read it, you'll know what I mean, right? Because, I mean, I don't want to, I'm not trying to make it too close of an analogy, because Paul actually experiences real manifestations of power, like transcending space and time, seeing different timelines, seeing visions of the future, which I suppose is possible, but not typical on an LSD trip, right? So I don't want to give too much of I'm not saying that, everybody who trips acid is going to see the future and you can choose between 50 different timelines like Doctor Strange. It is kind of like Doctor Strange, right? In the book, like Paul's experience is similar to that. But I think a lot of people probably have read this or read these stories, and they've missed the predictive programming illuminist elements in the story. To me, it was pretty obvious. And Gould and Fitzgerald make this connection, not about Dune, but about Afghanistan, when they say Afghanistan is the ancient home of Zoroaster and the mystical Avesta, as well as Gandhara. This region is talking about Gandhara Buddhism and the Illuminati Roshaniya cult, the order of the Baktashi dervishes. This is a 19th century Afghanistan, and its surroundings provided then a mystical underpinning to what is today dryly regarded as mere geopolitics. This is their book. With every advance of what is of the industrial era, the quest for meaning and spiritual enlightenment amongst Western intellectuals grew into a kind of hypnotism. Spiritualism and occultism found great popularity in European parlor society. With the expansion of empire interwoven with the expectations of end-time prophecies about to come due, a spiritual movement linking biblical prophecy to Britain began to grow. This is getting into the British Israelite heresy and the fascination with the British Empire to Afghanistan, which was not just about, drugs and British East India Company control. That was a big part of it. But there's also a mythical quasi-religious, you could say, motivation, spiritual quest, you could say. Guided by religious zeal and a great deal of imagination, the British Israel movement emerged from the shadows in 1794 with the publication of Richard Brothers' book, A Revealed Knowledge of the Prophecies of the Times. Then Sharon Turner's 1827 book on the Asiatic origins of Anglo-Saxons. This sought to establish Greater Persia as the ancestral home and progenitors of our Anglo-Saxon ancestors. Some in the movement proclaimed the British Army officer Sir Henry Rawlinson's successful 1835 translation of the Persian Behistun inscription as a positive link between Britain and so forth. And then we get Reverend John Wilson's Our Israelite Origin. This is trying to argue that the lost tribes of Israel somehow connect to this region and somehow are the forefathers of the British people. This is a long-standing, goofy kind of heresy that pops up every now and then in so-called Christian circles. For example, there was a cult that is lesser known today called the Worldwide Church of God. It was headed up by a guy named Garner Ted Armstrong. And they were an anti-Trinitarian group who were all about this British Israelite mythology. And for whatever reason, they felt like this made them special or something. According to Robert Dreyfuss in his book Devil's Game, many British intellectuals and not a few imperialists were seized with a desire to find a sort of holy grail, a unified field theory of religious belief. That's where we get the perennialist connection again to the ideas that I think undergird Dune. Because Britain is obsessed with a kind of perennialism. And perennialism is not exactly the same as Freemasonry. You might think, well, sounds like Freemasonry, isn't it? Just all the religions are basically the same. No, it's not exactly that. Masonry is a little more on the atheistic side. Masonry is a little more on the anti-metaphysics side. But what you have with perennialists is that the essence of religion and philosophy is metaphysics. And so it's a more highbrow, sophisticated approach to trying to figure out what the high true religion is. And it would disagree with a lot of the approaches of, say, Albert Pike in his Morals and Dogma. So as you know, we have, as we said, the Fremen, the desert people. This to me is very reminiscent of groups in the Middle East, such as the Sufis. It could be any kind of Muslim group, fighting the jihad to establish the pure worship of Allah or whatever. All of that, as we know, functions to influence the novel. And I noted that readers are shown a significant secret about realpolitics, and this that's not evident in similar novels. The attempt to manipulate bloodlines by the elite to produce a genetic superior ruling class. That's what the first book is all about. In Herbert's vision, the manipulation is done to control the Kwisatz Haderach by a female witch coven. As we said, the witch bitch is trying to emasculate me, trying to keep me down. But look, I can see where you can't see. That's what he tells the witch, if you remember right. The Gom Jabbar. I've looked into that place that you cannot look. Thus, if the super being could be controlled, the sisterhood could wield untold power over the universe through their adept skills at sorcery and word magic, which is really just a kind of mind control. They are trained in all matter of religious espionage skills. So espionage is a big part of this story, especially part 2. Part 2 is much more of a courtly intrigue power game than the first novel. The first novel is a lot more of an adventure. It's a very sophisticated philosophical adventure, but the second one is a lot more about courtly intrigue. But the sisterhood here, kind of reminiscent, kind of analogous to the way we think of like CIA handlers, right? That's kind of the function they serve in the novel, is to operate in that way. And they're arranged hierarchically under the chief Reverend Mother Gaia Samohim, Gaia, Mother Earth, right? So feminine symbology here, and this is interesting because the novel, I would argue, is has consistent strands of anti-feminism. So probably at the time, and I'm just assuming here, I haven't read a whole lot about Frank Herbert himself, but he definitely had to have been involved to some degree in the LSD counterculture 60s scene of his time. Just because of so much of that being in the novel, right? So I feel like he did have some knowledge of the way the world really works, how the CIA operates, how, the world is run on the basis of geopolitical elites, controlling resources, and engaging in things like economic warfare. Because we'll see, Paul will engage in a very sophisticated form of sabotage. In fact, when Paul's family is attacked in the first one, and he basically loses all the power that he had, and he flees to the Fremen, his plan of attack against the traitors, the Harkonnens, and the Emperor, is to cut off spice production from Arrakis. And so he engages in a few years of warfare on Dune, which cuts off all spice production, brings it to a complete halt. Now all the universe's eyes are on Dune and Paul. And then we get this kind of overthrowing of the Emperor and the Harkonnens, and Paul becomes a new Emperor. Or he's essentially... basically the first one ends with that, right? If you remember in the David Lynch movie, and I don't have my novel, the first novel, with me. I read it like 10 years ago, but I'm pretty sure that's how it ends, with Paul basically establishing the new world empire, or galactic empire. You know what I mean? Other interesting elements is that we are shown the PEDO elements of the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens are not just a brutal kind of degenerate crew. They are enmeshed in genetic experimentation. They like to create monstrosities and hybrids. They like to engage in all manner of degenerate practice, including PEDO stuff. And we get a very interesting contrast when the Atreides family takes over Dune from the Harkonnens, and the local tribes people, the Fremen, are astounded at how charitable the Atreides are compared to the Harkonnens. And so we're definitely given the impression that the Atreides are a righteous family and house. The Harkonnens are completely degenerate and disgusting. And we even see this in the imagery of the character of the Baron himself, right? I mean, the Baron is full of pus and sores, and he's basically leaking and dripping everywhere. You know what I mean? He's just making a damn mess, like he had a perm, a jerry curl just dripping everywhere, but it's coming out of his face. And I like the way the David Lynch version did that. I mean, he's flying around, he's getting oil dripped all over him. It's absolutely disgusting, right? So they did a good job making him disgusting. Also, as a result of this collapse, Paul believes that he will engineer a plan to stop the Emperor and the Baron's machinations by not just bringing the spice production to a halt, but also marrying the Emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan. And she's the floating head at the beginning of the David Lynch one, right? She's the narrator in the David Lynch version. We haven't seen her yet in the new Denis Villeneuve version, because that will be Florence Pugh, the chick from Midsommar. She's going to be Princess Irulan. And the Emperor is going to be, Christopher Walken. The Emperor put this watch in his ass. That Christopher Walken as the Emperor, which is an odd choice. I don't remember the actor that David Lynch cast, but I thought he was actually a really good Emperor. So, interesting choice to have Christopher Walken, who, it's not that Christopher Walken's a bad actor or anything, it's just that he, to me, seems to sort of a goofy character. So to have him as the, I was looking to see if I had a picture of the Emperor in the old one. Take this abomination from before me.
My brother comes for you, Emperor.
I don't. I can't find an Emperor picture. I could pull it up, but you know what I mean. That dude was well cast. That's what I think of. I just don't think of, I don't know, Christopher Walken. And I was watching somebody's video about this, and they made a funny point about how, remember in the Fatboy Slim video, how it talks about, you won't something the worm. If you walk without rhythm, you won't attract the worm, right? That's from Dune. That's the sand dance that you have to do because the vibrations attract the worms on the planet of Dune, and the worms come get you like Kevin Bacon and Tremors, right? Well, you do the dance to not attract the worm. That's what's clipped in the Fat Boy Slim video where Christopher Walken is dancing. And it's just weird then that Christopher Walken will be playing the Emperor in Dune. You know what I'm talking about? Did y'all not know this? Nobody knew what that clip was. If you walk without rhythm, it won't attract the worm. Bop, bop, bop. This one, right? Where Christopher Walken dances and flies across the room. Remember that? I'm not going to play it because it'll ding everything, but you can watch the video. I'll try to remember to put these video links below, right? So here Christopher Walken is dancing everywhere. Walk without rhythm, it won't attract the worm. And then he flies across the mall or the hotel, whatever it is. Remember when Christopher Walken was dancing the cha-cha with the aliens? Playing Whitley Strieber. That's one of the stupidest scenes I've ever seen. And the alien dance in Communion. Ooh, cha-cha with aliens. Wow. And you're saying, why is Christopher Walken dancing the cha-cha with aliens? Because Whitley Strieber, in his book, claims that he danced the cha-cha with aliens on a spaceship. So, definitely happened. definitely something that definitely happened. It's not made up. It definitely happened. You understand? Hope so. Anyway. Put your hand in the box. Anyway. Where was I? Oh, next up. Other elements that make this novel tremendously prescient. Again, pretty much off the charts predictive programming, right? I mean, not just predictive programming in the sense of like, oh, you got some MK Ultra. By the way, I forgot to mention the Imperial power has the ability to genetically condition and mentally condition people to be assassins or to be incapable of violence. So Dr. Yui, who has the dot on his third eye, has the Imperial conditioning supposedly so that he could not harm any of the noble houses. So anybody that serves the noble houses has the Imperial conditioning so that they can't be traitors to the Imperial house. Because, of course, people would want to assassinate the nobility all the time. And, in fact, there's an attempt, as you know, to assassinate both Paul and his father. The attack on Paul's father, Duke Leto, is successful. The attempt to assassinate Paul with the Hunter-Seeker is not successful. Paul, as we said, is the one, right? So he's the prophesied one to come who will bring the jihad. All of that is kind of classic, hero mythology, Joseph Campbell stuff. But it's also religious in the sense that, as I said, you think that he's a Christ-like figure in the first one. But he's much more of a flawed Greek hero in the second one. And we'll look at some of what his son explains in the introductory essay about what his father meant by that, by the political critiques in Dune Messiah. But I wanted to note that Herbert had an intense interest in ecology, and that's why we actually see geoengineering playing a key role in the novel. So stuff that you would think is, even in our day, considered, conspiracy topic. It doesn't exist. Not only does it exist, it was actually in fiction back in the mid to late 60s. And so I cited some papers and whatnot talking about ELF manipulation of the ionosphere and whatnot. And I argued that, Herbert foresaw what would be coming in the future and actually encoded it in his science fiction. So I would liken him in this predictive sense to somebody like PKD, right? He's a lot like Philip K. Dick, but he's very different from Philip K. Dick because Philip K. Dick comes off as this sort of basically schizophrenic type of character, right? I mean, I'm not dissing PKD. I think he's a cool writer, and I think he was writing stuff because he was in the circles of people in Silicon Valley, and he did genuinely kind of foresee the dangers that could be had through the implementation of all this Silicon Valley control, which we're now living under, by the way. Definitely PKD's novels are very prescient, full of predictive programming, but Herbert's novels are they're very different. They're all interconnected. It's all one big giant world or universe like Tolkien. And that's not what you get with PKD, right? You get these kind of just different stories about wild ideas, and many of those wild ideas, appear to be coming to fruition. But the same thing with Herbert's mega universe. A lot of these elements are coming to fruition as well. So I did want to touch on a couple more things in regard to part one. It's not just about the predictions of things millennia from now. It's actually about how the world functions now. The different strata of occultists, espionage, geopolitics, the polis, the emperor, the state, economics with the trading guild, the control of the resources, economic warfare by bringing resources to a halt, siege, right? When Paul brings spice production to a halt, all eyes are on Arrakis and all eyes are on Paul. And so by doing this, he then engages with his followers to become this religious warrior figure, and then begins what kicks off what will be the universal jihad. The novel's focus on ecology is also in a way a rebuke to scientism, which presumably desires to rape nature and to be anti-human. And you might think, well, science fiction, right? This is always going to be anti-human. No, actually, there is a tendency in Dune, at least so far in the first two, that is pro-human. There's a big story that we don't, it might be in one of the other stories, you might have a backstory by somebody else or by his son. I think Frank's son has also written addendums. I don't usually find the sons, I'm not reading Christopher Tolkien that much, or you know what I mean? So I'm not knocking the guy, just haven't gotten into it. But when it comes to this element, this is fascinating because I just totally lost my place. What was I talking about? The novel's focus on ecology, yeah. And, the anti-natalism. You might think that it would be anti-natalist. A lot of science fiction is like, the future is a utopia because we've created perfect population control and AI runs everything. No. This is uniquely anti-AI. Did you know the Dune universe, at some point in previous history, when man created AI enslaved man, and there ended up being a few centuries of warfare where men had to overthrow AI, and then AI is banned throughout the universe. However, even though it's banned after what's called the Butlerian Jihad, this figure named Butler had to lead a jihad against AI, and it was eventually overthrown. And so now artificial intelligence is banned. Now, not all tech is banned. Just AI. You can't make machines in the image of man. And in their Orange Catholic Bible, they introduce a new 11th commandment that thou shalt not make a machine in the image of man. So that's an interesting avenue where, a lot of sci-fi novels don't go. They usually prop up AI as this, quasi-savior type of device, or this salvific thing, or this godlike thing that's going to give us immortality or whatever. But even though it's outlawed in Dune Messiah, in the sequel, we actually have people beginning to go against that. And although they're not creating exactly AI, they are beginning to create what they call a Gola, which is a kind of like a clone. It's not exactly a clone, but it's basically a version of a clone where you take the dead body of someone and you can revive it with certain techniques and certain technologies closely akin to cloning. The difference being, of course, that the revived body is not a copy, it's the actual body. But it doesn't actually have the genetic memories or the memories of the previous person. So it's kind of like a blank slate, tabula rasa, doughboy over there. So you got a doughboy, a blank doughboy over there. But in Dune Messiah, the character of Duncan Idaho, one of the close friends of Paul, who ends up killed, they create a Gola of him, this sort of clone, to be a source of comfort for Paul because he's lost one of his best friends. But this ends up being a deception because the purpose of creating this Gola was also to mind control him, to program him at a certain point, at a trigger point. He's triggered to then assassinate Paul and get rid of the Atreides bloodline. That plot fails. Spoiler alert. But we'll talk about that when we get into Dune Messiah. Other elements that I thought were an influence here, as we said, not just the perennial stuff, but there's also, I think, a Kabbalistic element, because the weirding way is not just, saying something that's a magic spell. It's actually finding the right words and the right vibrations that either give life or can kill. And so we think about, Proverbs, the power of life and death is in the tongue, Solomon says. And then you get in the kind of outlandish superstitions of medieval Kabbalah, the idea that the individual magician or magus can figure out these right vibrations and words or manipulations of symbols and then either create or destroy life. And so you get the idea of the golem. The golem is this figure who is a kind of husk, a mud man, right? A husk man who you can cause to go and do your will. Well, not only does that come up with the ideas of the weirding way and speaking a word that can either kill or bring life, I think that's really what the Gola is, right? The Gola is not exactly a clone. It's more of a golem. So I think Gola is probably derived from golem. And a lot of the terms and a lot of the phraseology that's very unique to Dune, right? Like the Bene Tleilax, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, the Lizan al-Gaib, right? These terms are, you can see, kind of quasi-Arabic terminology and Islamic in its significance. They even call Paul the Mahdi, which is Messiah. So, going back to my notes, I think I've covered a lot of this. Space travel, yeah, we covered that. Mission area, Predictive. It's also a story that appeals to sort of esoteric-minded people as well. We know Jodorowsky, right? For example, Jodorowsky was famously making his Dune, version of Dune, which was this really wild, outlandish thing where Orson Welles said he would do it, but he wanted to be paid in food. And then Salvador Dali was going to be the emperor, and he said, I'll do it, but you have to pay me $100,000 a day. And just all this crazy, wild, outlandish stuff. And so it never ended up getting made. But there's a famous documentary about Jodorowsky's Dune. And we've covered Jodorowsky before because Jodorowsky is definitely a cult filmmaker, probably one of the preeminent ones. I do not recommend people watch Holy Mountain. It does have some interesting alchemical and esoteric elements, and we've covered it both with Burmis and with Jamie and I covering it here. So if you are interested in the Holy Mountain breakdown, it's there. There's other films that Jodorowsky did that are really occultic, like El Topo and whatnot. But let's see if there's any other elements that I didn't cover in the first one before we get to where's my essay? Before we get to part 2. Oh, I did want to talk about the crossing of the abyss. There's this sort of, when Paul undergoes the Shai Hulud, or they call Old Father Eternity, the worms are for the Fremen, an emblem of God, right? They're this sort of godlike figure. They also are an emblem of Satan, which I think kind of speaks to a weird sort of dualism in their religion. But when Paul Muad'Dib comes to power, you get the idea that natural hierarchies are being restored because he's overthrown the attempt of the witch coven of the feminine to be dominant, and you get this patriarchal order that's restored. Paul and the free men represent a masculine order being put back into power, and under this we get the life blossoming on the desert planet Dune. So the desert planet comes to life and becomes terraformed and emerges from this wasteland, kind of like what we read in Isaiah, right? That the streams in the desert, I think in the Psalms, and then the deserts will turn into, luscious valleys. It'll be the sort of a return from Eden. So that in the Bible you have this wilderness Eden imagery, and Dune itself, right, goes from being this dry desert planet to becoming this fountain of life, this water of life planet after Paul takes over and terraforms the planet. But what Paul had to do, as we said, was go through the worm bile ritual. Aren't you glad when you go to church you don't have to take worm bile? What if that was the sacrament every weekend, right? It was the worm bile. Wherein it experiences a crossing of the abyss to enter into the place where the Bene Gesserit witches cannot go. When Muad'Dib returns from this death resurrection ritual, he's apotheosized to bring an end to the rule of female power and the unrighteous, or what he sees as the unrighteous emperor. And I think in the Dune movie, it comes off that way. When we get to Dune Messiah, it's less clear that, certainly the Harkonnens are bad guys, but it's less clear that Paul is as righteous as he sees himself to be. And so, as we said, the Harkonnen have young male sex slaves. We see imperial brainwashing. We see noble houses with mind control assassins. We see MK Ultra. All of this is throughout this novel, as well as reliance on Kabbalistic ideas, as well as reliance on even predictive elements that we haven't seen yet, like terraforming, geoengineering. Nobody would have known about geoengineering, in 1968, 69, except people, working at the Jason Project or at Rand Corporation or something, right? We also see delving into, as we said, the ability of hallucinogens to bring higher states of consciousness, which again is not the Christian idea, very much a 1960s, revival of paganism idea. The idea that ecstatic initiatory experience is somehow preferable or somehow a shortcut to enlightenment is definitely what Paul undergoes, even to the point of a kind of death, burial, resurrection when he undergoes the really intense experience of drinking the worm bile, which causes him to basically almost die. But he comes back from that, as I said, with actual powers. He has kind of been deified, and he's called the One. They believe him to be the Messiah, the Mahdi. And then Paul, interestingly enough, plays on this. So, in the Denis Villeneuve version, you see the Timothée Chalamet character doesn't believe at first, but then he kind of gradually comes to believe more and more that he is the one, the chosen one. And that's not that's not the Christian view, right? Jesus doesn't learn new facts. He's a divine person. So he has omniscience. He didn't learn his godhood. He didn't doubt himself, right? But Paul, after fleeing into the wilderness with his mother, again, kind of Apocalypse 12 imagery, kind of, Moses going into the desert imagery, he learns the ways of the desert. Exactly what we see in the Bible about the character of Moses. And again, Paul was a Moses type of baby as well, because the Bene Gesserit witches wanted any male child put to death. And that's why I think there's a kind of a pretty consistent anti-feminist theme that undergirds this story. And the Bene Gesserit, as we said, were intent on religious engineering. So you've heard our buddies over at PsyOp Cinema talk about religious engineering and the state, the power structure of the deep state, the oligarchy wanting to control and steer religion. That's what we saw throughout this text. That's principally one of the key elements in why the papacy becomes what it does in the second millennium, contrasted to the functionality of the papacy in terms of collegiality and synodality in the first millennium. And we get this Gnostic version of religion, of the Fremen, and a process philosophy that will evolve out of the primitive religion of the Fremen, which in this story we're told that, in the second one, they're told that they reinstitute animal sacrifices. And maybe even human sacrifices. It's a little unclear. It just says they've reinstituted blood sacrifice, which it's unclear if that means animals or humans. But the Sardaukar apparently engaged in human sacrifice because they had upside down people on upside down crosses. In the movie, there was a brief scene of this where they're draining the blood to mark the Sardaukar on their forehead before they go to wipe out the Atreides family. So there you have, that's our first hour here, our first half discussing the perennial philosophy of Dune. And in the second part, I'm going to get deep into Dune Messiah. And the reason I want to talk about Dune Messiah is because there will be a movie, according to Denis Villeneuve, if Dune Part 1, Part 2 is successful, they do intend to make Dune Messiah into a full-length film as well, which will be really crazy, will be really intricate courtly intrigues. Be fascinating to see that come to life probably in the next few years. So hopefully people can be watching this video even 2 or 3 years from now when Dune Messiah gets made into a movie. Maybe even you can share this, send this to your friends and people that would like insights into the real world from fiction. I think genius fiction, even though I don't agree with all the Gnostic and Nestorian and Illuminist and Perennialist elements of the novel and Part 1 and Part 2, we can begin to see a lot of insights into real world geopolitics in terms of how the elites want to control drug lanes, how the elites want to destroy their enemies through economic warfare, how the power structure uses manipulation of bloodlines, genetic engineering. A lot of that we're going to see in the second one. And, we're going to have questions about how we should be governed. Is an oligarchy good? Is Paul a tyrant? Is he an autocrat? What about the religion that evolves out of Paul and his jihad, the Church of Muad'Dib? What about the feminine principle? Because we're going to find out that his sister Alia, there's going to be a cult that grows up around her. And what if, she becomes this sort of scarlet, this woman, this Babylon woman, as the story progresses. And part of that has to do with infant child trauma. Because if you remember, Alia was born with basically adult consciousness and with all the powers of a reverend mother. So this made her a very oddball child. People were always very afraid of her. And she sort of develops into this villain figure that we'll talk about later. But I don't want to go too much into that because that's for Part 2 when we get deeper into Dune Messiah, its themes, its critiques, and its esoteric meaning. So hopefully you enjoyed this. I want to remind you guys, too, that to support the show via Super Chats, you can leave a Super Chat at any time, and I will read it the next time I'm doing Super Chats. I think we have a couple here from last time. Let's see. Kristen sent $10 and said, this is for talking to that Hebrew Israelite. Thank you, Kristen. We had about 20 people that subscribed over on Streamlabs. Thank you. Thank you to Gino and Greek Jimmy, who had Gillapong, who had left Super Chats in the past. I think we had a $25 one from Turtles. Thank you for those. So you can leave a Super Chat anytime, and I'll try to read it the next time around. You can also subscribe to my website, get access to the Part 2s. This Part 2 will be up in the next day or two. Remember to, again, head over to chalk.com. Get a hold of this Chad mode, this great pre-workout. You want to drink some of this Chad mode before you're going to the gym. It will definitely strengthen, your approach to every workout. I mean, that sounded really dumb. It will energize you, I guess I should say, for optimizing a workout. So if you want to optimize your workout, definitely utilize the promo code J50 over at chalk.com to get a hold of that Chad mode. And I want you to know that they have on the very top here of Chalk the Chad mode as their lead sale there. And you won't pay $134. You get it with the Tone Kettle and the Action 2.0. You're going to pay 50% off of that by using the promo code J50. That's JAY50. JAY50 to get 50% off that performance stack right there at chalk.com. We love Chalk. Awesome base company. Be sure and head over there and use that promo code. You can also get all the other products. Hormone health, mood and focus, sustain energy. You can detox. Superfoods, the chocolate, the cacao, collagen support. It's all over at chalk.com. Again, use the promo code J50 to get 50% off. If you want to get recurring subscriptions to just have that stuff coming every month, you can do that as well using the promo code J53LIFE. That's JAY53LIFE. JAY53LIFE to get 53% off of that excellent performance stack as well as all the other products over at chalk.com. Remember, head on over to Rockfin and subscribe to our sister podcast, Richard Grove at Grand Theft World, as well as subscribe to me on Rockfin over here. You can get my philosophy course. Look at all those amazing videos that are up over at Rockfin just now today. There's a lot of content over there. There's some unique content there. There's also unique content on the website if you subscribe at jasonelsis.com in the member section. And good news for those who are asking about books. And this analysis of Dune, by the way, is in my second book. So I finally have gotten the book orders. I haven't mailed them out, but I'm saying that the back-ordered books, there were books that were back-ordered, and we were gone for 3 weeks on the Italy pilgrimage. Our Hajj, I'm just joking, but they use Hajj in Dune. Those books are going to be able to be sent out in the next few days. So good news, by next week, pretty much all of the orders should be caught up. So if you've been worried about your book, hey, it's been 2-3 weeks, I apologize. We were out of town. We're back now, but when I got back, I could not get a hold of a couple places to order. I did get a hold of them yesterday, and so that's all the orders. So we should be fully stocked up next week. All the book orders will go out. So thank you for your patience, and part 2 will be up in the next day or two.